The first thing Kael Voss did after the explosion was count the bodies that weren't his students. 4 Threshi mercenaries lay scattered across the marble floor of the royal solarium. Their chitinous armor cracked open like eggshells. Smoke curled from a shattered viewport. Somewhere beyond the ringing in his ears, alarms wailed across the palace of Vethira Prime. Kael knelt beside the only person who mattered, Princess Ilyra Sol'Kaen, 17 years old, third in line to the Vethiran throne, her silver eyes wide with something he'd never seen in them before. Not fear. Recognition. "You're not a tutor," she whispered, staring at the plasma pistol still smoking in his hand, at the blood, not his, soaking through his plain gray sleeve. "You never were." Kael didn't answer. He was listening to the calm chatter, bleeding through the dead mercenary's earpiece, calculating how many more were coming, how many minutes his princess had left to live if he made one wrong move. 3 days earlier, he would later say, when the histories asked him to explain it, "I was just a man who taught a girl how to read old Terran poetry. That was the whole job. I swear it." But that wasn't true. And everyone who watched what happened next would come to understand exactly why. 3 days earlier, the Vethiran royal court had been arguing about him. "A human," spat Counselor Draeth Umves, his 4 eyes narrowing with contempt. "Teaching the princess poetry. Your Majesty, humans arrived in known space 11 years ago. They have no fleet worth mentioning. No colonies beyond their single dying homeworld system. No technology we couldn't reproduce in a decade. And you've placed one alone in a room with your daughter. Queen Ilyra Sol'Kaen, ruler of the Vethiran Compact, did not look up from the reports scrolling across her desk. He was recommended by the Cultural Exchange Bureau. His references were extraordinary. His references, Draeth said, list him as a former educator. Nothing more. No military record, no family lineage of note. He appeared from nowhere 3 years ago and has been quietly employed ever since. He teaches my daughter to think for herself, the Queen said. In a court full of people who'd rather she simply obey, that is worth more to me than a lineage. Draeth's mandibles clicked in disapproval, but he said nothing more. He would remember this conversation soon enough, remember it with a very different kind of fear. Ilyra, meanwhile, was in the East Garden, arguing with her tutor about a dead poet. He says grief is a debt the living pay the dead, she said, tossing the datapad onto the stone bench between them. That's absurd. Grief isn't a transaction. Kael Voss, 41 years old, quiet-voiced, with the kind of stillness that made people forget he was in the room until he wanted them to remember, allowed himself the smallest smile. Isn't it, though? You carry something you can never repay. You just keep paying anyway. That's the most human thing I've ever heard you say. I am human, Highness, every single time. She rolled her eyes, but she was smiling too. In 3 years, this man had become the only person in the gilded, gossiping labyrinth of Vethiran court life who never once treated her like a piece on a board. Her mother loved her fiercely, but saw a future queen. Her tutors before Kael had seen a prize student. Draeth and his faction saw a liability. Kael Voss simply saw Ilyra. She had no idea that he had chosen every single lesson, every walk through the gardens, every seemingly idle conversation, as a way of learning the palace's guard rotations, its blind spots, its people. She had no idea that former educator was a truth with several silent words missing from the end of it, but no one expected what happened next, because even Kael hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The attack came at dusk, during the Festival of Ascending Light, when half the palace guard was reassigned to crowd control along the outer wall. Kael felt it before he heard it. A wrongness in the air pressure, the kind of silence that comes right before violence. He was walking Ilyra back from the solarium when the first shot took out the corridor's security drone in a shower of sparks. Down, he said. And the change in his voice was so absolute, so unlike the gentle tutor she knew, that Ilyra dropped to the floor, without question, 6 Threshi mercenaries in unmarked void-black armor swept into the corridor. Professional. Efficient. Not here to kill. Their weapons were set to stun. Their movements built for a capture, not a massacre. "The princess is the prize," their leader barked over comms. Veteran military encryption cracked wide open. "The tutor is nothing. Leave him." That, Kael would reflect later, was their first mistake. He put himself between them and Ilyra without seeming to move at all. One moment beside her. The next, a wall of calm, terrible purpose. The first mercenary to close the distance found his stun baton caught, twisted, and turned against him before he understood he'd lost the exchange. "Run to the East Archive," Kael told Ilyra, low and even as if he were correcting her pronunciation of an old Terran verb. "Seal door 7. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'm not leaving you. Ilyra." Just her name. No title. It was the first time in 3 years he'd said it that way, and something in her chest cracked open at the sound of it. "Go," she went. Everything changed in the next few seconds. What the mercenaries encountered next was not a tutor. It was 11 years of dormant training, Terran special reconnaissance, the kind of program that didn't exist on paper because the people who ran it had learned, in humanity's brutal, near-extinction wars of the previous century, that the best operators were the ones nobody suspected. Kael Voss had been quietly recruited by Earth's newly formed Diplomatic Protection Corps, precisely because he could disappear into a role, precisely because he could sit in a garden discussing poetry for 3 years without once breaking cover. He broke it now. 5 mercenaries went down in the space of 40 seconds, not killed, but broken in ways that would keep them from ever holding a weapon again. The 6th, smarter than his companions, retreated toward the solarium, dragging a captured palace guard as a shield and screaming into his comm for reinforcements. The truth stunned the entire palace when the drones caught it on record. A single unarmed servant had dismantled a professional strike team in under a minute. But Kael knew, with the cold clarity of a man who'd done this before, that the real attack hadn't started yet. 6 mercenaries wasn't an assassination. It was a distraction. He found the real strike force in the solarium, exactly where he'd have placed them if he were planning this. A secondary team of 4, already breaching the archive's outer door with a plasma cutter, patient and precise, completely unaware their diversion had failed. Nobody knew what the human was hiding, not even the princess he'd sworn to protect. What followed was not a fair fight. It was a lesson, the kind Kael had spent 3 years teaching in gentler forms. He used the solarium's ornamental water fountain as cover, its shattered stone as improvised shrapnel, the mercenaries' own overconfidence as a weapon against them. When it was over, 4 more bodies lay across the marble, and Kael Voss stood alone, in the wreckage of a room built for admiring sunsets, breathing hard for the first time all night. That was the moment the archive door hissed open behind him. Ilyra had heard the fighting stop and, against every instruction he'd given her, come to find him. "You're not a tutor," she whispered. That wasn't even the biggest surprise of the night. The biggest surprise came 20 minutes later, when Queen Morel arrived with a full honor guard to find her daughter alive, 10 enemy combatants restrained in makeshift bindings, and her daughter's poetry tutor sitting calmly on an overturned bench, field dressing a shallow blaster wound in his own shoulder as though it were a paper cut. "Who?" the queen said very quietly. "Sent them." Kael looked up. For the first time since she'd known him, Ilyra saw something old and tired behind his eyes, the weight of a man who'd carried far more than old Terran poetry across the stars. "Counselor Draith's private security contractor," Kael said. "I recognize the encryption protocol. I've been tracking irregularities in his household accounts for the last 4 months. The council had made a terrible mistake, and it wasn't the one they thought. Draith had wanted Ilyra removed, not killed but controlled. Leverage to force the queen's hand, on a trade concession that would have enriched his family for a generation. He had gambled that the human tutor was exactly what he appeared to be: harmless, disposable, irrelevant. He had gambled wrong in the weeks that followed. As Draeth's faction collapsed under the weight of treason charges, as the Compact's other great houses quietly reassessed everything they thought they knew about humanity's irrelevant homeworld, Kael Voss remained exactly what he'd always claimed to be in the one way that mattered. He stayed her tutor. "You could have told me," Ilyra said. Weeks later, in the same garden, on the same stone bench, the poetry datapad between them once more. "Would it have changed anything?" Kael asked. "Would you have trusted a soldier the way you trusted a teacher?" She thought about that for a long time. "No," she admitted finally. "I don't think I would have. Then I told you exactly what you needed to know," he said. "The rest was never a lie, Ilyra. It was just quiet." She picked up the datapad, scrolled back to the poem about grief as a debt the living pay the dead, and found, for the first time, that she finally understood every word of it. Not as an abstract idea, but as something a person could choose to carry, silently, for years, simply because someone else was worth the wait. "Teach me," she said. "Not poetry, what you know, what you can do." Kael Voss, quiet soldier, gentle tutor, one-man army wrapped in a scholar's stillness, allowed himself a rare, full smile. "Highness," he said, "that was always the plan."